This is another situation with a rook versus, well, you have an extra rook for one side. This time there's no kind of extra pawn, so the previous situation had a pawn on e3, and this basically makes the winning attempt a little bit harder, because now when white sacrifices his rook for the pawn on b5, it will mean that there's only one pawn left on the board, and as we saw in the basic endgame series, king and queen versus king is a complete draw if the weaker side can connect the kings. So if white now tries to just do the same technique, push the king back and then sacrifice on b5, it turns out that black can actually draw the game with accurate play. There's an important position here actually where black has to make the right decision. He has to play king to h7. If he plays king back to g8 and gets trapped on the back rank, then it is possible for white to sacrifice the rook, and then once he queens the pawn, he has this important move queen b2, and black can no longer connect. But if black is aware of this or calculates it correctly, then he should play king to h7. And this is a little bit different because if he's pushed back this way and white sacrifices on b5, it's not too late for white to use the correct technique, which I'll show you in a moment. But if he's gone this far, it will generally mean that he's not aware of that and he's fixated on this idea of sacrificing. But if he sacrifices now, then black's king actually gets to c2 and he has two options, and therefore white's queen can't block both of them and it will be a draw. So after king to h7, it's actually not possible for white to force the king into the position that he wants and sacrifice on b5. Therefore the best technique that white can use, if we go right back to the beginning, is actually to push the king towards the other corner, towards a8, around where black's pawn is. And this technique comes up in quite a few rook and pawn endgames, in that you're kind of forcing the king to a position where it's close to the pawn, and then you're going to try and maneuver the king so that it comes so close to the pawn that you're going to be able to explode the king. So the move order here is not particularly important, so say king a8, white could play rook a7 check, I think king b8 check. The king can try to run away. If it goes to b7, then simply rook c8 kind of speeds things up a little bit, and we'll see how white makes progress in a minute. But after king c7, you play rook d8 and kind of bring the king back in. If the king went up to c6 now, then the win would be quite simple, because you play rook d7, force it to b6, and then rook b7, and you're winning with rook takes b5 on the next move. So instead of king c6, more tenacious is to play rook b7, now rook c8, again just reeling the king in, forcing him to come back this way, rook c7, and then you got the check and the win. It wouldn't have really made much difference if black had played king a7 here, and after rook b8 you're forcing him to move next to that pawn, and then you win like that. And this technique is less common than the one in the previous video, but it's a useful one to be aware of, because it can be the only way that the stronger side can win these endgames. And yeah, it can definitely win you some points, and avoid that kind of problem that you saw if you're fixated on sacrificing on b5. You can actually end up giving black the draw that he doesn't necessarily deserve. So that's it for in this series for rook endgames. I'll probably come back to rook endgames in some of the more advanced videos, but for this series that's the end. We're going to move on to knight next, and then finally bishop, which kind of have a, as you go through knight and then bishop, you get a lower and lower chance of winning chances for the stronger side. The rook endgames are the really ones where almost always you can win. So if you get these endgames, you should really be able to put the weaker side away. It's only very rare cases where it's not possible.